There comes a moment in the life of nations when the question is no longer academic, philosophical, or reserved for diplomats speaking in polished tones inside conference halls. It becomes immediate, urgent, and unavoidable. That is the moment the world appears to be entering now. Humanity must decide whether it prefers a future built on order, peace, cooperation, and prosperity, or one surrendered to chaos, perpetual war, coercion, economic sabotage, and destruction. What we are witnessing today is not mere instability. It is the systematic weakening of the very principles that were supposed to prevent the world from descending once again into the law of the jungle. The framework of international law, imperfect as it has always been, is being pushed aside by brute force, selective morality, improvised military adventurism, and the dangerous assumption that might is right. Once that assumption is normalized, no country is truly safe, no region remains insulated, and no economy is immune. At the center of this crisis is a contradiction that has haunted the international system since 1945. The United Nations was established in the aftermath of a catastrophic world war to preserve peace, restrain aggression, and provide a rules-based forum for resolving conflict. Yet, embedded within that architecture was a fatal concession: the veto power granted to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. That clause, sold as a practical necessity of post-war diplomacy, has over time become one of the greatest enablers of paralysis, double standards, and impunity. In theory, the United Nations Charter commits member states to respect sovereignty and refrain from the threat or use of force against other nations. In practice, however, one permanent member can shield itself or its allies from accountability, block meaningful intervention, and neutralize the very institution designed to uphold peace. That is not collective security, that is legalized geopolitical privilege. The result is the world we see now: a dangerously fractured order in which powerful states can violate the spirit of international law while continuing to speak its language. The law remains on paper, but power increasingly dictates reality. That is the tragedy of the present age. The latest and perhaps most combustible expression of this disorder has been the escalation of conflict involving Iran, driven by the familiar axis of American military muscle and Israeli strategic calculation. Once again, the world is dragged toward a wider inferno by decisions taken not in the interest of global peace, but in service to ideology, domestic politics, strategic vanity, and hegemonic reflex. The consequences of such wars are never confined to the battlefield. Bombs do not merely destroy military targets. They shatter civilian life, poison regions, displace families, destabilize markets, radicalize populations, and plant the seeds of future wars. This is one of the oldest lessons in history, yet it is the one modern empires refuse to learn. Wars are often launched with great fanfare and simplistic rhetoric, but once unleashed, they obey no script. Those who begin them do not always control how they end. Entire regions can be consumed by consequences no war planner anticipated. Blowback is not an accident. It is the natural offspring of reckless intervention. And beyond the human toll lies the economic earthquake such conflicts trigger. A war in a major energy corridor is not a local event. It sends tremors through oil markets, shipping lanes, insurance costs, food supply chains, inflation rates, currency stability, and debt markets. Fragile economies are pushed closer to the edge. Import-dependent nations are squeezed. Central banks become trapped between inflation and recession. Financial markets shudder. Investors retreat. Households everywhere pay the price for decisions they never made. This is how regional wars become global burdens. A bomb dropped in one country can raise living costs in another continent. A blockade in one zone can trigger industrial stress thousands of miles away. What begins as strategic aggression quickly mutates into worldwide economic pain. That is why peace is not a sentimental ideal. It is a practical economic necessity. Yet, to understand how the world arrived at this perilous point, one must also examine the nature of the leadership driving much of the turbulence. Donald Trump has come to symbolize a dangerous strain of politics that confuses theatrical aggression with strength, volatility with courage, and bullying with leadership. His political style has always thrived on division, shock, personal glorification, contempt for restraint, and a cynical exploitation of public anger. What might once have appeared to some as anti-establishment disruption has matured into something darker, a governing instinct rooted in impulse, grievance, revenge, and chaos. The problem with such leadership is not only moral, it is civilizational. When the head of the world's most powerful military state is guided less by statesmanship than by ego, resentment, and brute instinct, the danger extends far beyond his own borders. Institutions are weakened. Truth is degraded. Diplomacy is mocked. Law is treated as an inconvenience. Opponents are demonized. Public discourse is debased. The culture of governance becomes indistinguishable from the culture of intimidation. And that is precisely what much of the world has been forced to endure. What should be serious statecraft increasingly resembles a gangster performance wrapped in patriotic slogans. Emergency powers are stretched. Constitutional norms are tested. Courts are insulted when inconvenient. Political rivals are framed not as competitors in a democracy, but as enemies to be humiliated and crushed. In foreign policy, the same logic prevails. Threats replace diplomacy. Sanctions become routine weapons. Wars are marketed as necessity. Economic punishment is dressed up as moral leadership. This is not order. It is imperial disorder masquerading as strength. Even more troubling is the broader political culture that permits such behavior to endure. How does a system continue to elevate a figure so deeply controversial, so repeatedly engulfed by allegations, scandals, legal turmoil, and institutional confrontation? The answer lies not only in one man, but in the decay of political judgment within the system that sustains him. A democracy becomes vulnerable when institutions lose courage, parties abandon principle, media ecosystems fracture truth, and sections of the public begin to mistake aggression for authenticity. That is how dangerous men survive politically, not because they are wise, but because the structures around them grow timid, compromised, polarized, or morally exhausted. The deeper issue, therefore, is not only Trump as an individual, it is the world order that keeps producing, enabling, and protecting leaders who treat war as spectacle, law as inconvenience, and human suffering as collateral to ambition. It is a system in which the architects of violence often write the narratives about violence. It is a system in which those who destabilize regions still claim to be guardians of stability. It is a system in which the same powers that arm conflicts later preside over the humanitarian conferences that lament them. Such hypocrisy is one of the defining obscenities of our age. A sane world would move in the opposite direction. It would strengthen international law rather than hollow it out. It would reform global institutions so they cannot be hijacked by the very powers most capable of destabilizing peace. It would insist that no nation, however powerful, be treated as above the rules. It would recognize that sovereignty cannot be selective, that civilian life is not expendable, and that peace cannot be sustained where justice is routinely vetoed. A sane world will also understand that prosperity is born not from domination, but from stability, production, trade, innovation, energy security, and mutual respect. Bombing campaigns do not build civilization. Sanctions do not feed the poor. Regime change fantasies do not produce development. Occupation does not create legitimacy. Humiliation does not generate peace. Every serious society knows this. The tragedy is that those with the greatest capacity to to destabilize the world often behave as if they do not. The choice before humanity is therefore stark. We can continue down this path of militarized arrogance, selective legality, geopolitical manipulation, and endless retaliation. Or we can recover the older, wiser truth that peace is not weakness, restraint is not surrender, and order based on justice is infinitely superior to chaos enforced by fear. The world does not need more wars sold with clever slogans. It does not need more doctrines of preemption, more coercive alliances, more economic strangulation, or more leaders intoxicated by their own power. It needs sobriety. It needs accountability. It needs diplomacy with backbone. It needs institutions that serve humanity rather than the ambitions of a few capitals. History will not be kind to this era if it continues on its current course. Future generations will ask how so much destruction was justified in the language of freedom, how so much lawlessness was tolerated in the name of order, and how so many powerful people watched the flames spread while insisting everything was under control. Peace, order, and prosperity are not utopian fantasies. They are the minimum conditions for a livable world. Chaos, war, and destruction, by contrast, are not signs of strength. They are symptoms of political failure, moral bankruptcy, and imperial decline. The world must choose, and it must choose wisely, before the merchants of chaos drag humanity into disasters from which recovery may take generations. For deeper analysis across a wide spectrum of geopolitical, economic, and social issues, and to explore a rich archive of thought-provoking articles, I invite you to visit my website at www.oblongmedia.net, where a treasure trove of insightful content awaits. Thank you.